Hey folks, here at OS Reviews. You're watching our video review of the ZTE Warp 7. This is a 5.5-inch phablet that has actually pretty good mid-tier specs, inclusive of a 13 megapixel camera, a quad-core processor, 2 gigs of built-in RAM, at a very affordable price of under $90 without a contract. So ZTE has been on a roll lately, starting with the Axon 7 about a year ago, with flagship level specifications at an affordable sub $400 price, and the Warp 7 is in many ways a continuation of that, but now at an even lower cost. The phone can be found available at many prepaid networks, including Boost Mobile, but in our case, we're looking at this device provided courtesy of Tello, which is a competing, customized, pay-as-you-go provider. And we'll be doing a more complete review of their services soon, so be sure to stay tuned for that. For now, we'll be just focusing on this device as a smartphone. Starting with the design, the overall dimensions of the Warp 7 are very similar to the aforementioned Axon 7. It's still relatively easy to hold with one hand, but at 5.5 inches gives you a large display size to use for watching media and also browsing the web. The screen itself also has a protective layer made by Corning Gorilla Glass 3, which means it's very impact resistant as well as scratch resistant, and that is certainly the case in our testing so far. It has gotten virtually no scratches. However, it is very easy to attract fingerprints and smudges, which makes it slightly more challenging to see in outdoor environments. Regardless, the gentle curves of the glass makes navigation and swiping between panels a breeze, and overall it just feels like something much more premium in the hands. On the bottom, you'll find access to capacitive keys that takes you back home, back, as well as opening the multitasking drawer. Overall, these keys are in the same layout as well as in the same design as the much more expensive Axon 7, so this is a design element that's been carried over. Bezel size for this phone are also respectable, although the top and bottom bezels are admittedly a little large for a phone that doesn't have front-facing speakers. The edge bezels on the left and the right are actually, again, fairly good for this price. On the side of the device, you actually won't find anything at all. The top houses a traditional 3.5mm headphone jack, which is always a pleasant addition to any phone. On the right-hand edge, there's access to a dedicated volume rocker and a power on-off switch. This entire band that's running across the phone that looks metallic is actually made out of metal. It's a very thin piece of metal, but it has a cool touch when you're picking it up and gives a bit of extra durability to an otherwise lightweight phone. Furthermore, the keys here are also etched in metal and feel very tactile and responsive. Another impressive element of the Warp 7 is it's using the standard, or at least new standard, of USB Type-C for charging. It does offer quick charging as a result, and you can easily juice up the 3000 milliamp hour capacity battery in under an hour and a half, which is again very impressive. This new USB Type-C port also allows for faster data transmission and additional hubs and accessories to be supported. The back of the phone also looks very clean and elegant. On first blush, you might be thinking, well, this probably will be the same material as on the OnePlus One, which is this sandstone, almost like a sandpaper texture. However, what looks like a very coarse material is actually soft. It feels like just any other soft touch rubber material. It's very easy to grip and also something interesting to look at that I think will work well with a slightly larger phone like this. The back also houses the speaker, which unfortunately is mono and isn't the most ideal in terms of placement, but nonetheless gets fairly loud. And there's also the ZTE logo along with the aforementioned 13 megapixel autofocus enabled camera with an LED flash. For several years now, ZTE has been showing ambition in crafting smartphones that are middle to high end in terms of specs, but are priced like budget handsets, and we see that once more with the Warp 7. In terms of the overall UI, it's running on a very light skin that's crafted by ZTE, but everything is still highly familiar, and at the same time you have access to fairly traditional controls. With that being said, this particular version, again by Tello, or if you pick it up by Boost, does have a few kind of pre-installed bloatware on it. For one, you have access to an array of Amazon services, such as Amazon Video, Kindle, Music. There's also the standard Google accessories like Chrome, camera, clock, calendar, drive that are pre-installed, and there's even a few social media network services like Messenger and Instagram thrown in for good measure. There's also, again, access to a sound recorder, an FM radio, and what's interesting here is Dolby Audio. A lot of recent ZTE phones and Lenovo devices have been incorporating Dolby Audio as a digital sound enhancement lately, and it actually does work surprisingly well. It significantly improves improves the way you experience audio when plugging in headphones and listening to your tracks or watching a movie. There's a quick demo here, but in terms of what you can do with it, you can create various categorizations. Individually tweak these equalizers, which changes the sound signature, and it's smart enough to recognize in the future when you are trying to access a movie to go into the settings that you've saved. So it's actually really fun to play around with these custom graphic EQs. Alright, so going back and playing the demo here very quickly, it's also a good way to showcase the experience of the screen. So yeah, it's a very short little demo, but you can definitely hear that the sound is actually surprisingly good in terms of its loudness. Now granted, the speaker doesn't have that much bass, it's easily muffled up by your hands, but as a whole, very good for a low-end smartphone. It packs quite a loud volume, and more importantly, there's clarity as well. That often translates to good separation and movement if you're listening to movie soundtracks, for instance. Alright, so the screen here is also, again, pretty good. It's a 720p HD panel. It's not full 1080p, which is kind of what we want on a larger 5.5-inch display, but nonetheless, it works well because it has wide and generous viewing angles because of the IPS technology, and overall color saturation is also quite good. Using 720p also means that the battery life is excellent. With a 3000 mAh pack, I was easily able to last around 2 days on a single charge with sporadic use in between, and again, it's very quick to charge up that battery. Other elements have been slightly tweaked, include the ability to use a gesture of swiping anywhere from the bottom here to access the notification shade, which is quite useful on a phone, again, with a slightly larger screen that might be harder to reach one-handed for some folks. Taking a look at the camera next, the interface has been customized by ZTE. It's fairly simple and gives you also quite a few effects to play around with. Now, it reminds us of iOS to a certain extent, and this is the same interface we've been seeing from quite a few recent ZTE devices. You can see the autofocus works pretty well. It's not quite as fast as something that's laser assisted, of course, but it's fairly accurate. You can tap to focus, and the auto mode actually does a surprisingly good job in most circumstances. From here, I can also just swap to the front-facing 5-megapixel sensor. I can change things like create a 5-second countdown timer. I can also change the flash profiles. Under here, I can also change the resolution, etc. Under the Pro mode, that's when things get interesting. I can change and create different grids and lines for a better, again, adjustment of my angling of shots. This is the golden spiral. And I can also change the ISO settings, exposure settings manually, which is, again, things that you can tweak to make your images look better. Under the fun mode, you also can create different effects live, such as comic, macro, fisheye, warm, mosaic, and furthermore, I can also have smile detection, HDR, and panoramic views that I can play around with. So as a whole, there's quite a few things that you can do with this camera, even as a budget-oriented phone. So you can see here that our shots do have sufficient detail, colors are decent. It does have a tendency to get a little bit more confused in terms of coloring when you are pointing it at a light source directly, as you can see there. But in an outdoor environment with good lighting conditions, we were actually fairly impressed with the camera quality. It produces a good amount of detail and, as a whole, produces realistic looking colors. And again, on such a low-cost phone, I think that you'll have a pretty good experience with the camera overall. It's certainly good enough to post to your social media as well as for sharing to friends and family when on the go. Alright, so talking about the phone call quality next, because that is still the most important element of any smartphone at the end of the day. Luckily, the microphone on here sounds excellent. It does have a bit of noise cancellation as well, so even in outdoor environments where it's loud, where there's wind, it tends to cancel out those sounds and just pick up your voice. As a result, our callers said that we sounded natural and loud in our test calls, so that's good. Reception is also pretty strong here in the San Francisco region, at least with Hello support. And Hello is kind of piggybacking off of Sprint service. So you can see that right now we have close to full bars of reception, even though we're indoors. So certainly no issues as far as connectivity with 4G LTE. Next, let's talk about the web browsing experience. Now, again, in terms of the specifications, we are talking about 2 GB of RAM and a quad-core processor. At the end of the day, this is not going to be a powerhouse phone, but for most pages, once it's loaded, you can see it renders fairly smoothly, especially mobile optimized pages. You'll occasionally encounter some moments of hesitation and sluggishness, but it's not crippling, and as a whole remains an enjoyable web browsing experience. I do prefer Chrome because I think it's slightly more smooth when you are using it as opposed to the default browser, and there's also tab browsing where you can share your information with the desktop version if you have been logged in. This is the default virtual keyboard. You can see that keys are fairly large and they're comfortable to use when typing along. There's also swipe that's been enabled. So again, we are loading up the full version of New York Times, which is a good benchmark as a complex site with many ads as well as moving interactive elements that often low-end hardware will struggle with. You can see that indeed it definitely takes a little bit longer to load than on your latest Snapdragon powered flagship device. However, you can see that scrolling is actually fairly smooth and responsive. And although the screen isn't full 1080p, it's honestly not that pixelated. It actually looks sharp enough with good contrasts and colors that browsing the web again is an enjoyable experience. Pinch to zoom is also quite lucid and responsive. So even on a site like this, if it takes a few seconds longer, it does eventually completely load, and it is a very usable experience. Otherwise, you can load up videos directly using the browser, of course. If you want to play back YouTube, I would still recommend the mobile app since it seems to be slightly more optimized as far as loading times and buffering. The virtual keyboard, one last thing I want to mention is even though the keys themselves are quite large, sometimes there is a little bit of hesitation or delay. So you do have to kind of wait a second before rapidly texting too much. So that's more or less it as far as the essentials of the ZTE Warp 7. Is this a flagship? Absolutely not. It's more of a entry-level / mid-tier device that is super affordable and has surprisingly good performance as well as ergonomics and build quality for the price. Yes, it has a 720p panel instead of 1080p, and also yes, performance isn't going to be as fast as higher end SoCs on the market. But as a whole, I think for the general consumer, it more than does the trick. It's smooth, it's responsive. I had no crashes at all in my testing. Yes, I had to wait maybe a few seconds longer for things to load, but overall RAM management seems to do pretty good. Even with tons and tons of apps open, you can see that multitasking is still quite swift and responsive. And although it's not instantaneous, things are still relatively smooth on this phone. ZTE has done a good job of keeping things fairly minimal, but also adding their own tweaks on top of Android to make it slightly more usable. And in this case, I think it comes down to a pretty good user experience with its curved edges on the display, the nice texture on the back of the device, and also a fairly good camera for such a low-end device. So if you are on a budget, you're looking for a solid, maybe backup, maybe even as a, again, main daily driver, if you aren't super demanding in terms of playing back too many titles and games, this will more than suffice. So you can check out more details about the ZTE Warp 7 in our official written review, but for now we'll say this is an excellent, good value phone with a nice 5.5-inch display. Thanks for watching.